All rise.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, my lord. Sir, you told us that you cleaned your cell. If you didn't do it, would somebody have done it?
No, you clean your own cells.
Was that the instructions?
Well, you know, sometimes they would tell you, but generally you wanted a clean place, so you cleaned it. As I said, they did have, sometimes they used other detainees, like they used Mr. Larumo to clean the corridor. It's possible they could have get him into an empty cell to clean whilst you were out. That you don't know.
Okay.
But generally that didn't happen. I think he only cleaned on the outside.
Did they give you utensils to clean your cell?
You would have to ask, so they would give you a bucket and some cloth. And sometimes I think there was also a broom around which you could use.
Yeah. And once you are cleaning your cell, would they be watching you, or you would be on your own?
You would generally be on your own. They would just leave it, and you'd clean.
Okay. Would there be an occasion where you would be required to wear a tie?
No.
Did you keep a tie in your cell?
No. No, you didn't keep any clothes, if I remember. It's all kept in the room. You wouldn't need a tie, and very few people who were active, I think, would generally then have worn ties. I guess only if they had appeared in court or something, but then you would be at the waiting trial part. So people just wore tracksuits generally.
And were you ever charged for any offense? That is now during 1982, at the time of the death of...
No, I wasn't charged around then. I was once charged in relation to an anti-tricameral campaign, I think a few years later, but it was a minor charge.
Yeah.
Someone came, assaulted me, and when I laid charges, he laid a counterclaim.
Yeah.
It was 2 times bigger than me, I think. Even the apartheid court threw it out.
I see. And what do you think would have happened to you if you refused to withdraw your complaint of assault against Venter and Swanepoel?
Look, generally, you lived in an environment where nobody could protect you. And if you didn't do what they asked you to do, the risk you faced was you would be beaten up brutally. As I said, we knew that with the death of Dr. Aggett, that they would be perhaps a bit more constrained than they would normally be. But that didn't mean they couldn't beat you up brutally. When you were a security cops, I guess, and not that I've had this experience, it's like if someone were to break into your house and you're the only one and they have you there for the whole night, and you know they can do anything to you and beat you up. You fear for your life. You fear that someone's going to injure you also very badly and viciously. So that fear is always there when you're in detention, from day one right up to when you release.
My lord, I've got no further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord. So I understand that it is difficult for you it's a difficult time in our history as well as for you personally. I act on behalf of Ulf Venter as well as Dietlefs. My instruction from Mr. Venter is that he admits that during your interrogation, which he was part of, that he took part in an assault on yourself, that he actually insulted you, as well as that he used derogative words in relation to you. He admits that he did that. He did so in front of the TRC, and he's got his amnesty for that. Do you have any comments to that, sir?
Well, I'm pleasantly surprised that he admitted what he had did. And as I said earlier, I wasn't aware that he had done so.
Your evidence at what stage was when you were at the showers and you left the showers, you went back to go and fetch your towel. That's correct. Where did you keep your towel? Did you keep your towel in your cell?
No, your towels were kept in the room where your clothes were kept.
The property room.
Yes, so the procedure is that you go and get your towel before you shower. And remember that the police are watching, and that you then go into the shower, and when you finish, you take your towel back to the room, and any other, like you may have dirty clothes, you take that back.
So your evidence in relation, as per your table of events that you wrote, the little calendar that you wrote, so that between the 25th and the 29th, that was when more or less you were taken up, not necessarily simultaneously, but you saw Dr. Aggett when you went up and or when you returned to your cell.
Yes. Well, not return, when you're taken up. Okay, because that tended to be this similar time, give or take 10-15 minutes.
Yes.
So depending on if you will, if it was very fast. In fact, the police complained that I was not as fast as Dr. Aggett in having a shower, okay? And so, just depending on the time, I would often bump into him there, and once or twice on the 10th floor, but from afar. But close to each other when we are at the first floor to leave, because that's just, there's a gate that you...
Well, at the first floor, was there a register which was filled in before you then went to the 10th floor? But I'm specifically referring to the first floor. Was there a register?
Yes, but we don't sign those registers.
Yes.
Those are signed by the officer or the warder who's on duty, together with, I guess, whoever's taking you out.
And we've heard evidence about what is referred to as clusters and complaints.
Yes.
Or clusters. Were there, did you make complaints in a book? Was there a book that you could enter complaints in?
Yes, and if I remember, that was on the second floor,
Yes.
okay, where there would be a book. They didn't bring it every day, and in theory you could go there and complain, but again, you're not going to complain because it gets to the security police, so you generally, I don't think I bothered to complain there in the book.
And the following week, the week of the 1st to the 4th, the fatal week, I
Yes.
may call
Yes.
it that. On the 1st, that Monday, did you once again go up with, or did you once again see Dr. Aggett when you went up?
Look, I don't know the exact days. I didn't keep a record of that. But I know that, definitely on the 3rd or the 4th I did. And it was happening fairly regularly. So, at least the week before and that week, it could have been at 2-3 days. We were being checked out in the first floor around the same time. But I can't tell you which day. And on that Monday, I'm not sure if he was actually brought back, because he had been out the whole weekend. So I don't know if I don't remember whether they brought him on a Sunday night and took him out again on Monday. I don't. And you asked earlier, generally the time you came back was not the same time. It depends. When they finished with you, they would send you back to the cell. And so,
So what actually interested in you're not clear whether it is the third or the fourth where you saw him with the injury to his head.
Yes.
If I'm correct. Did you see him in that week before that, or what? I know it is difficult, but is it possible for you to say whether you saw him in that week without the injury?
Yes, no, I saw him a few times the previous week, and he had no injury on his face. The only day I saw it was the last time I saw him, when he was being taken out for probably was his last detention, or the second last day of his detention, of his interrogation. Sorry.
Your statement in paragraph 66, you said you had a glimpse of Dr. Aggett on the 10th floor on the 1st or the 2nd of February 1982 when he was writing a statement as you have previously have done.
Yes.
And when you saw him at that stage, would you have seen that whether he was injured at that stage already, or did he look to you to be fine?
No, look, it was a glimpse from far, and it may have been that they were taking me from one office to the other, or maybe they were taking me to the toilet or something. Because generally you were not walking around in the corridor. You were only in the office in which they interrogated you, and you stayed there. And you only, you couldn't get up and go where you liked. You were only there, and then they would, if they want to, they can take you from office A to office B. So I don't remember the exact reason, but that's where I saw him, and I saw two policemen over him. But it was very far, I didn't see much, but I had known that he was going through a tough time, having not been there for the weekend. Clearly he was under pressure.
Thank you. Well, I've got no further questions to witness. Thank you, sir.
This is Peter's report, my lord. I'll just have a single question, my lord, and I'll be quick at it. So, I represent the current police force as it is. So, during your examination in chief, and in your closing remark, so you mentioned the line whereby you stated that you hold the police responsible. So, I just want to clarify that. From my understanding into the context of your evidence, so it would be apparent that you hold the past police force responsible, separate from today's police force, as we know it, post the democratic era.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I can be even more specific. I hold the security police at the time responsible for his death, Dr. Aggett's death. I'm not talking about the police today.
On behalf of the police force, we apologize for what happened to you as past that.
Thank you.
We have no questions on examination. Mr. Munyata, tell me, when you say the last time that you saw him live, he was in a company of two police officers, or did you say one?
I don't remember how many, but normally it would be one. There might be a second one around. It could be two. I mean, I don't remember, because you're handcuffed. There's no way you can escape, and you just escorted. I think normally there used to be two who would come, but I don't remember who they were today.
And you say that this would have been either on the 10th or the 4th of February?
Yes. During the inquest, the first inquest, I did say it's the 3rd.
The 3rd?
Yes, so it was the day before, but looking back, I still think it could have been even the day after. So on the day that he had his last detention, on the 4th. So I'm not sure of the 2 dates. It's too long ago now to remember exactly.
And it was on the 10th floor?
No, on the first floor. So the cells are separate buildings. So you go down to the first, and when they check you out of the, that's where you get checked out of the prison cell building, and you go into the building of the police station to the 10th floor.
So he must have been from the 2nd floor where he slept, and then was taken to the 10th floor.
So first we get taken to the first floor. That's where I saw him. Okay, we both brought by the security branch officers who are escorting us. They have some procedure in a book, and they check you out. And once you get checked out, and you go separately, you get taken to the 9th floor, and then you go up with 10, something like that. But so I saw him still in a prison cell building on the first floor.
Now, the officers who were with him, you say were secret branch officers.
Yes.
Now, were they white or black?
Generally, there would be black security branch, but there were times that white police officers would come. They were those that came were quite junior. They would just be white or black, and they would just be escorting you. They wouldn't know what you were interrogated about or so. Their job was just to make sure they brought you, that you don't speak to another detainee. And in those times, I guess they told that you're a terrorist or something, and they got to watch. And so they kind of also scared of you.
Did you know a security branch officer by the name of Whitehead?
I do know of him, and I know he was part of that team. I didn't have any direct interaction with him. He may have been present in my first assault, but I don't remember all the people who were there. That's the day after I was detained, when there were 10 or more officers who were kind of throwing me around. He may have been there.
What I want to get at the police officers that you saw with Neil, none of them was Whitehead.
Probably not, because anyone who was part of the interrogation team, they were clearly more senior. They didn't come down to the cells to pick us up. So I don't think so.
Any questions arising out of
None, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
As it pleases. My Lord, our next witness is Mr. Maurice Smithers. He's currently waiting outside, and I understand he has been summoned. While he's being brought into court, perhaps I can refer your Lordship to the affidavits we're going to have reference to. That is the affidavit of Mr. Maurice Smithers himself. My Lord, in the first week of the inquest, we handed up his affidavit as Exhibit G9. My Lord, we also have reference to the affidavit of Mohammed Gordon Maketa, and that is Exhibit G6. I do have spare copies. as the court pleases.
Yes, Mr. Smith,
Maurice Peter Smithers.
do you have any objection because of Mr. Swipe oath?
I usually affirm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you affirm that the evidence is complete, will be the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do.
May I proceed?
As the court pleases. Mr. Smithers, thank you for agreeing to testify about your experiences back in 1981 and 1982. We certainly understand that this requires you to, in a sense, relive some of those experiences. And on behalf of the Aggett family, we express our gratitude for being willing to do so. Before we proceed, I understand that you wish to make a short statement to the court.
Yes, sir.
Please proceed.
Thank you. Judge, over the past few weeks, I've received a number of messages from people thanking me for testifying at the inquest and telling me how brave I am to do so and so on. And obviously I appreciate their comments and their messages, but I think it's important for people to know that there's no need to thank me, and I don't think that I'm being brave. I'm just doing what's right. I testified back in 1982 because it was right to do it then, and I'm testifying now because the imperative to speak remains. But I'm not saying that it's easy. In fact, I've realized that when talking about what happened, when going into the details, I often choke up and I'm unable to continue speaking. It's an indication to me that I'm carrying emotional baggage from that time and other similar occasions, that I've never dealt with it. But that was how many of us handled things. We soldiered on regardless of what happened, what we'd been through, because the times demanded that of us. I suppose it may have been better to have had some form of counselling, but I didn't, and so at times I do find tears filling my eyes, my voice breaking, responses triggered unexpectedly by something that I or someone else says, by a thought or by an image or something. And the point is, I know that's going to happen during my testimony. In fact, it happened, I don't know if you noticed, at John Forster Square last Tuesday during our visit to John Forster, and I had to stop speaking at some point to recover. But I want to reassure the court that it won't be a problem, it won't affect my testifying, and it won't disrupt proceedings. In fact, I want to talk about the positive aspect of such emotions, of the impetus to cry. Reverend Paul Lorraine, who I saw yesterday, pointed me to a quote from Charles Dickens, which helps to explain this. Dickens says, in Great Expectations, "Heaven knows we need never be ashamed of our tears, for they are rain upon the blinding dust of earth, overlying our hard hearts." So what he's saying really, I think, is that giving way to emotions, allowing tears to flow, particularly in this context, is an affirmation of our humanity and our dignity and our ability to empathize. In 1982, humanity, empathy, dignity were the last things on the minds of the security police when they arrested us and they attempted to get information out of us. In fact, Jimmy Kruger, the infamous Minister of Police, exemplified that most crudely in 1977 when speaking about the death in detention of Steve Biko. "Dit laat my koud," he said. "It leaves me cold. It means nothing to me. It does not touch me." Long-term detention, solitary confinement, verbal and physical abuse, sleep deprivation, torture, these are all mechanisms used to break down dignity and deny humanity. The 1982 inquest, too, had no interest in humanity, in empathy. The purpose of the state, the security police, the state attorney, the magistrate, wasn't to find out the truth behind a tragedy, behind the ending of a human life, possibly by the person's own hand. They wanted simply to cover it up, to point fingers in every direction but towards themselves, to use the occasion for political gain. They didn't care about the feelings of Neil's family, of Liz Floyd, of Neil's friends and comrades. It was an inhuman, callous event without redemption. As counsel for the family and a former TRC member pointed out at the beginning of this inquest, humanity has also been sacrificed on the altar of political expediency since then. This inquest, the Timol inquest, and a proper investigation into the death of Abraham Ongopotse Tiro, who was killed by a parcel bomb in Botswana on 1st of February 1974, 46 years ago, this Saturday past. All of these should have been processed a long time ago. They weren't, and so Neil's parents and his brother have passed away without finding peace, their humanity denied, the humanity and dignity of Neil not restored in their lifetime. So, if my tears do come, and I'm sure they will, I won't be ashamed of them. They are, to me, an affirmation of humanity and my recognition of the humanity of others. This process itself, though belated, is about honoring Neil's humanity, driven as he was in everything he did by his concern for the well-being of others, particularly those exploited, oppressed, and discriminated against by apartheid, one of the most dehumanizing social experiments in human history. So if I do break down, I don't want the court to adjourn. I'll recover quickly and I will continue. I also don't want people to, get concerned for me. What I would prefer is that in the moment that happens, I'd like everyone here to reflect on what we are doing here, on the role that this process is playing in restoring the humanity and dignity of everyone involved, including, I might add, that of the police officers who have chosen to tell the truth during this inquest. The police officers who, because of apartheid and their own dehumanization as black people, were unable to speak honestly and openly at the first inquest. I don't blame them for what they did then. I honor them for what they're doing now. They are the ones that I consider to be brave. So thank you to everyone who's involved in this process. Thank you all present for listening. And thank you to the court for allowing me to express myself.
Thank you, Mr. Smithers. And even though you don't expect any particular special treatment, if you need a moment to catch your breath, just indicate as much to the court. And feel free to stand, but there is a chair if you wish to. Mr. Smithers, I understand that you have before you an affidavit that you made out on the 15th of July 2018.
I do.
That's Exhibit G9, my Lord. You confirm that this is your affidavit and you confirm the contents therein?
I do, Judge, but there's a couple of, having gone through this again and again and going through my testimony or the record of the previous inquest, I do realize that there might be one or two slight variations, and I feel more confident referring back to the original testimony because that testimony was given 2 months after the incident of Neil's death, and so I had a much stronger memory. But they're minor things. It's about what happened when, but it doesn't change the essence of the testimony.
That's fair enough. And at any time during the evidence today, you are free to point out and indicate where there might be an inconsistency, and you're free to explain it. So you do confirm that you did testify before the first inquest?
Yes.
And did you make out an affidavit before the first inquest?
Would that have been with the
statement? Most
with
likely
the attorneys?
With the attorneys for the Aggett family. Well, let me put it to you this way. The record does disclose that that an affidavit was taken from you at that time. I can advise the court that notwithstanding our best efforts, that particular affidavit is not in the record as it exists at the moment. We have a suspicion that it is part of the missing folder B2, which we hope to recover within the next few days. All right, Mr. Smithers, let's commence. You were born on 21st November 1951.
Correct.
Can you describe to the court your current occupation?
I currently work for a non-governmental organisation called the South African Alcohol Policy Alliance, which is working to increase the capacity of civil society to have a say over government policy around alcohol legislation, that kind of thing, yeah.
And I see when this statement was taken, you were a full-time student at Wits University doing a Masters of Science in Development Planning.
Correct.
And did you graduate with that degree?
I did, yes. Thank you.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
And I see that you've also occupied a few other posts, including work with organisations such as Aware to, a People's Platform for Social Justice. What did you do for that organisation?
That was an organisation that was, I guess, trying to address some of the challenges that were happening in South Africa about 5-6 years ago, kind of leading up to the around the issues of state capture and various other challenges were happening in South Africa, and denying social justice to people in the country who, as a consequence of the corruption that was taking place, were being denied access to service delivery, improvement in their lives and so on, yeah.
And previously you've also done work with the Yeovil Bellevue Community Development Trust.
There I was working. I lived in Yeovil Bellevue for many years, and it was a transitional suburb that previously white suburb that had gone through lots of changes in the post-apartheid period, and we were trying to develop a program whereby the community could have direct involvement in the way in which the suburb developed, and dealt with some of the challenges that were prevailing in the suburb at the time.
And previously you were a director in the then Gauteng Department of Agriculture, Conservation and Environment.
That's correct. For 10 years I worked for the Gauteng provincial government, and then just before that I was in national government. So that was post 1994, obviously, with a new government. Yeah.
And just to complete the story, what job did you do with national government?
I was Director of Communication in the Department of Land Affairs.
Now, if we can take you back in history somewhat, to the early 1980s, to the period before you were detained, can you describe to the court what occupation you were doing, as well as what kind of political activism you were involved in?
Well, perhaps I should go back to 1972, which has some relevance to something I said in my opening statement, and that was that in 1972 I was at Wits University, studying there, and I hadn't really been exposed to politics very much as a typical white male person growing up in South Africa. But when I got to university, I began to develop a social and political consciousness. And in the middle of 1972, about June 1972, at Wits University there was a protest, which came in the tail end of a series of protests that had happened in black universities and then in Cape Town University, around the expulsion of Abraham Onkgopotse Tiro from Turfloop University because he had the temerity to challenge the apartheid system and Bantu education when he was doing a valedictory address at Turfloop University. And so that was my political blooding, I guess. I got arrested a few times that week and beaten up by the cops and got charged with riotous assembly together with about 60 other students. And that kind of set the scene, I suppose, for the future direction of my life. So over the next few years, I went to Lesotho as a volunteer. I left university, I dropped out which is why I only went back to university now. I dropped out of university and went to work as a volunteer teacher in Lesotho. Then I came back and then I worked for the National Council, the South African Council of Churches, running a shop for them, a craft shop. And the Council of Churches in those days was a political centre really for the anti-apartheid movement. And I therefore came in touch with a whole range of people like Beyers Naudé and Wolfram Kistner and Desmond Tutu, Frank Chikani, and so on, including some black consciousness organizations that had offices in the building where I was working. So that kind of continued my involvement in politics. I did a few other things after that, and towards the end of the 70s, I did some traveling around the country, buying and selling crafts, and realized that there was a problem with the sustainability of community projects. And so the Council of Churches gave me the money to go and do some research. And that research led me to travel around the country, visiting projects, talking to them, finding out what the issues were, which was a very interesting process. And in that period, I also traveled to Botswana, because I went, it wasn't just in South Africa, but in Southern Africa, and I went to Botswana, and in fact, I went originally to meet a young man who had been in the Council of Churches building, who had left the country after the 1976 uprising, and he was living in Botswana, living with an ANC activist called Joe Klabi. And myself and a friend went to visit him, and Joe Klabi wanted to recruit us to teach politics to young black activists. And I didn't feel qualified to do that, to be honest. But also, myself and my friend, I think, were more oriented towards working with trade unions. And so it happened that a friend of mine, Jenny Curtis, or Jenny Skoon, as she was then, was living in Botswana with her then husband, Mario Skoon, who was an ANC activist who'd spent 12 years in prison. They both left the country and they were working for the ANC and for SACTU, the South African Council of Trade Unions. And so we were recruited by them to do work for SACTU and ANC, but mainly SACTU. And so 79 is when myself and this friend were recruited. So we came back to South Africa and we're doing...
Just to be clear, recruited
into the ANC, correct. Into the ANC underground, correct. So it was just the two of us, although we also then recruited my then partner, to work with us. And then, as a result of the research I did for the Council of Churches, I then set up a small project, whose name I still can't quite remember. It was something like, it was about buying raw materials. It was called the Raw Materials Project, something like that. It was buying raw materials to make them available to projects around the country so they could get the goods at a cheaper price and therefore make their projects more sustainable. And that's where I was working at the time that I was detained in September, 22nd of September, I think it was. I was also involved in sort of clandestine printing of political posters, trade union posters, and that sort of thing. And that all led up to the period, the 22nd of September.
So you were detained in the early hours of the 22nd of September 1981.
Correct.
But it appears from the affidavit that not much happened in that particular detention. You were released after a period of 2 weeks.
Yeah, I was arrested. I had no idea why I was being arrested initially. The police came to the house in the early hours of the morning, but while I was while they were sort of standing on the pavement outside the house, I heard on the walkie-talkie of the police the number of, they mentioned the telephone number of Barbara Hogan. And I realized that it wasn't just me being arrested. So that was a little bit comforting, because I thought perhaps I was being arrested because of our underground work. But when I heard Barbara was being arrested too, I didn't think that was the case, because although I had a close relationship with Barbara and we considered ourselves to be political comrades, and we did have a lot of discussions, and she had actually had quite an intense discussion with me about whether she should leave the country shortly before that. She didn't know exactly what I was doing. I didn't know exactly what she was doing. So it made me realize it was something different, but I had no idea what it was. So they took me into custody and put me in Randburg police station, and I was questioned quite extensively for that period of 2 weeks, and then released, along with some of the other people who had been arrested at the same time.
And at that time, you were not aware that your name appeared on the so-called close comrades list that Barbara Hogan had drawn up?
You know, I think I only discovered that, I doubt that the security police would have told me that. So I think I probably only found out when I came out of prison, yeah. Or when I came out of detention. I think I probably found out then.
My Lord, that list which has been referred to in evidence previously is Exhibit B3.5.21. Mr. Smithers' name appears under the last in the last category. Barbara Hogan had a list of people who regarded her as their consultant. If we can then move to your next arrest, Mr. Smithers. And that story, I understand, commences on the 25th of November 1981.
Correct.
In, of all places, the Magistrates Court in Johannesburg.
Correct.
So if you can just indicate while you were in the court and how it was you got to be arrested.
Well, yeah, there was a young man called Les Lax who lived in the same house that I did. And before I'd been arrested, I don't remember what date it was, he was also arrested from the same house because he and two friends had been caught. That was the year, I think, the 60th anniversary of the Communist Party. So they'd been arrested putting up posters around town commemorating the 60th anniversary of the Communist Party. And what I didn't know actually was that he was actually in Randburg police station. So for the 2 weeks that I was in Randburg police station, I think on the last day I discovered that he was there, which was a real pity, because it would have been better for both of us if we'd known we were there. We could have shouted to each other or somehow communicated, but we didn't manage to do that. So on the 24th of November, he and these other two were appearing in court to be charged with putting up posters. And I went to the court, and when I went into the court, security policeman walked in, Warrant Officer Detlefs, I think he was at the time, and he saw me in the gallery and beckoned to me to come to him, and then he walked out. So clearly he wanted me to meet outside. I then informed my partner who was there, and I also informed Neil Coleman, whose father was the head of the Detainees Parent Support Committee. And so Neil came with me to Neil followed me to Detlefs. By the time I'd spoken to Detlefs, he said to me that the captain wanted to ask me more questions. And I said, "Are you arresting me?" He said, "No, we're not arresting you. We just want you to come down to the station and ask answer a few questions." And I said, "Okay." And then Neil came up, and I said to Neil, "Detlefs says that I need to go to the station to answer questions, but he's not arresting me." Well, of course, he wasn't entirely telling the truth, because I was then arrested and kept for another 4 months. And they again arrested me and took me to to Randburg Police Station, back to exactly the same cell in Randburg Police Station, and then a whole new period of interrogation commenced.
So when you said that the captain wanted to speak to you, who was it referring to?
That was Captain Van Niekerk, I think his name was. I think his name does appear. I always get mixed up with the. I think it was Van Niekerk, Captain Van Niekerk. He had been the person who was interrogating me the first time.
So from the court, where did you go? Where were you taken?
So from the court, Judge, I was taken to. I may have been taken to John Forster first, but the very same day I was taken back to Randburg Police Station.
Yes. Yes. In fact, your affidavit discloses that you went straight to John Forster Square. You were formally arrested in terms of Section 22 of the Terms and Act, and then you were taken.
Correct.
Back to Randburg Police Station, where you say you were detained for 4 months. And yes, holding for 4 months certainly qualifies as an arrest and a detention. So you were held at Randburg Police Station, but that you indicate that from time to time you were taken up to John Forster Square.
Correct.
Just remind me, Section 22 of the Terrorism Act, what does it comprise of? I know Section 6, but Section 22, what is it?
My Lord, it also provides for detention without trial, often seen as the sort of slightly lighter version of Section 6. But we can let you have a copy of that. So, you indicate, Mr. Smithers, that during this period you were not tortured per se, but nonetheless held in solitary confinement. You also say that later in your interrogation it appears that they were particularly interested in a piece of information relating to Barbara Hogan.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that?
Judge, what happened was it became clear when they were talking to me that they had somehow gathered new information. When I was first detained, the questions were quite general, I think, as I recall, and not in great depth. But now, this time, and it appeared that they didn't know anything about my underground work. But the second time, it appeared that they had some information and they wanted to get more information out of me. So they were asking me lots of different questions, but then they honed in on a particular issue and they kept on asking, did I bring anything back into the country from anybody, for anybody? And to be quite honest, I couldn't remember having done so. And they kept asking about that, and particularly asking if I brought something from Botswana, which is partly, I think, what confused me. Because eventually they said, did I not bring back a box of chocolates for Barbara Hogan from Botswana? And that's when I remembered that, in fact, I had been to Zimbabwe in mid-1980, just after Zimbabwean independence. And the purpose of going was partly to go and visit friends and celebrate Zimbabwean independence, but it was also, the plan was to have a meeting with Marius Squin, a debriefing session with Marius Squin. Unfortunately, he didn't make it to the meeting because of a strange honesty that he had, because he actually went to the border post at Plumstead, and they asked him if he'd ever been convicted of a crime. And he very proudly said that yes, he'd spent 12 years in jail because of ANC activities, so they wouldn't let him in the country. So he had to go all the way back to Gaborone, and he then sent another guy called Patrick Fitzgerald, who was a friend of ours, who was also in exile living in Gaborone, he sent Patrick to come and see us, and we had a debriefing. And Patrick gave me this box of chocolates. It was sealed, proper box of chocolates sealed with cellophane and so on. And obviously I assumed that it was not just a box of chocolates, that there was probably something in it. I also assumed it wasn't anything particularly dangerous like explosives or anything like that, because it didn't have that kind of weight or capacity. But I didn't ask, obviously. I just said to Patrick, I assume this is not anything dangerous. And I brought it back and gave it to Barbara, and that was the end of it. And so I confirmed that had been the case. One of the things that I did all the way through my testimony was to tell the truth as much as possible, because I realized that one of the things is it is a kind of law of this kind of work, that you tell the truth as much as possible, because the more lies that you tell, the more you have to remember. The more lies you have to remember that you told. So therefore it's better to tell the truth wherever you can, and save the lies for the really important stuff. And so I did that all the way through, and there was no point in denying the box of chocolates, because they clearly knew about it anyway. How they knew about it, I have no idea. But they did.
So then, Mr. Smithers, you indicate that you spent an entire month at Randburg police station, where they left you in solitary confinement. How were you feeling at the end of that month of solitary?
Well, solitary confinement generally is, even if you're surrounded by other people, which I was, obviously, because I was in a police station, there were lots of other people around, and obviously I did see people in the sense that the police came in, but I had no human contact, no real human contact with anyone, and it became increasingly difficult. Also just being inside that space all the time, because at the time that I was, the first month was when I was being interrogated. I was taken through to John Forster quite often, and I had to eventually write a statement and so on. So at least I did manage to be out and to see the world on the way, on the journey between the two places, and I also got to see, occasionally get glimpses of people. For example, Neil himself at certain times. But then the month, once they finished my statement, they just left me there, and I think it was from the 4th of January, I was stuck in there, and I just started to feel what they call stir crazy. You just want to get out. You want to just be somewhere else. So I was feeling the pressure of being in this isolated space. Yeah.
And so it appears that you took some steps, you engineered a situation to get you out.
Correct. Yeah.
Of Randburg police station.
Yeah.
What did you do?
Well, what I did was I knew that my experience up until then was that the police were fairly responsive if you needed to go to the doctor and so on. So what I did was I broke the lens of one of my pairs of glasses. One of the lenses from my pair of glasses. I broke one lens, and I then told the uniform branch that I'd broken my glasses, and they informed the security police, so they would then come and fetch me and take me to the optician.
Did that indeed happen on the 25th of January 1982?
That indeed did happen, yeah.
Can you indicate approximately, who came to collect you, and at what time you made it through to John Foster Square?
I think my appointment was for 10 o'clock. So 2 black police officers came and fetched me, and I think we arrived there somewhere just after 9:30.
Yes. And then you proceeded to the 10th floor.
Correct.
And since you were present at the inspection in Loca, do you confirm pointing out to the court where it was that you were taken?
I do, yeah.
And now that we're in court, can you just give a description of the office you were in, and if you recall the office number?
The office number was 1011, I think, and it was a. We used to come up in a lift from the basement. There was a lift that served only the 9th and 10th floors, which is where the security police were. So we would go into the basement and then go up in the lift and come out of the lift and walk down a long corridor with officers on either side. And I guess halfway down the corridor there was a door to the left, and they took me into that room. It was a largish office which could have I remember it being used. It seemed there was fingerprint equipment around, so it seemed like they did fingerprinting and other things there, and just a few tables and chairs in the room. As you went into the door from the corridor, you were facing directly to windows which looked out of the building, and I was taken into the room towards the left-hand side and sat in a chair with my back to the wall. So the windows were on my left and the corridor was on my right.
And directly opposite you stated in an affidavit that there was a wall or a partition. Can you describe the makeup of the partition?
All the officers seemed to have this. There was a partition that was up to about waist height, was wood, and then above that was glass. But it was a kind of ribbed glass with vertical undulations, if you want to call it that. So it wasn't clear glass, but it wasn't opaque.
So you could see through the glass, but your vision was somewhat obscure.
Correct.
In your affidavit at paragraph 20, you say that you were there for approximately 3/4 of an hour with a few black security police officers. What then transpired?
Well, shortly after we'd arrived there, we sat down, and they were keeping me there just until it was time to go to the optician. I looked ahead of me and I saw that there were people in the room next door. The room appeared to be quite a lot smaller. It was obviously the same width, but it didn't have the same depth as the room that I was in. And there were a number of people standing there, one of whom I recognized as being Dr. Neil Aggett. And initially it appeared he was surrounded by a number of other people, and he appeared to be talking to them, gesturing and so on. I didn't recognize any of the other people, but Neil I could recognize because he had a very distinctive face, distinctive beard and so on. So eventually most of the people left the room, and I think there were only 2 or 3 police officers who were, what I assumed were police officers who were with him, who were actually then talking to him, engaging with him, and he was standing all the time. And as I said, I could see him gesturing and engaging with them, and them engaging with him.
When you say he had distinctive features, what were they?
Well, he had a beard, and I don't know how to describe, but a particular shape of face, and his gestures, his movements. I knew him fairly well, so I knew how he moved, how he walked, and so on, how he held himself. And so it was very clear to me that it was him. Even though I couldn't what I realized is that I couldn't recognize any of the other people because I didn't know them. there was nothing to help me to identify them. But in the case of Neil, it was quite clear that it was him.
Had you known Dr. Neil Aggett before detention?
Absolutely, yeah.
Can you describe to the court how you knew him, what kind of relationship you had with him?
Well, we moved in the same circles. We were in the same communities, political, social, cultural communities. So we would see each other at events, at parties, at friends' houses, and that sort of thing. I didn't work directly with him. I knew that he was a doctor. I knew that he was working also in trade union work. I'd been on a couple of social events with him as well. I knew that he had been in a long-standing relationship with Dr. Liz Floyd, but that towards the time that we knew each other, they had some kind of separation, and I saw them. So I saw him independently of her, it appears from my affidavit, which is something I had completely forgotten, that he and I were actually talking about moving into a house together, because I'd been living in Yeovil, and after the time of my first arrest, I had decided to move to Crown Mines, where a lot of our community was living. And it appears that I had been having discussions with him about the possibility of us sharing a house together.
So you were quite familiar with Neil Aggett,
yes,
even before your detention?
Absolutely.
Then let's pick up the story. You were indicating that initially Neil was standing surrounded by a number of other individuals. Some of them left.
Mm-hmm.
And then what transpired?
Well, as I said, for some time, all the time that I was there, for that period, there was this intensive engagement going on, a conversation going on between them, where there was, gestures. It was quite clear there was a dynamic going on of conversation, so it was clear to me that they were interrogating him in some kind of way. It wasn't a friendly conversation. It wasn't four guys standing around having a chat. They were moving around him all the time, and he was, confronting him almost. It was a kind of sense of them circling him and confronting him on issues and so on. And then I got taken away, and I got taken to the optician. I was worried about what I'd seen happening with Neil, and it turned out that the optician that I was going to, that the police were taking me to, was in fact my own optician. What I learned later on was they were taking me there because he was the optician that they used for prisoners normally. So it was a complete coincidence. And I had thought that because he'd been my optician since I was about 10 years old, my first pair of glasses I ever got was from him. I thought I might have the opportunity of saying to him, could he send a message to my then partner, telling her that I'd seen this thing happening with Neil, and just letting people know that he was being intensively interrogated and so on. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that because when we got there, the police officer who took me, who was a white police officer, he was quite happy to sit outside the booth, where they examine your eyes. But the optician insisted that he sit inside the booth while he was testing my eyes. And later on, I spoke to him about it a couple of years later, and he said it was because he didn't want to compromise himself, put him in a situation where he might end up being accused of collaborating with one of the prisoners. So I had no opportunity to tell him anything. And then we finished the consultation, and they took me back to John Vorster Square.
And where were you taken on your returned to John Foster's?
I was taken back to exactly the same room, and I was left in the same room again with one or two black police officers, and waited until they were ready to take me back to Randburg Police Station.
And what did you witness while sitting in that room?
Well, what I saw when I got there was that Neil was still there, but now the whole scenario had changed quite dramatically. He was, first of all, he didn't have a shirt on. Before, when I'd seen him, he was wearing a white shirt, collar shirt, and now he was clearly without a shirt, because I could see that he had no top on at all. And now he was being made to do a variety of exercises, and these exercises, and again, I couldn't see all of the exercises, but I made certain assumptions around what kind of exercises they might be, given what I saw happening. So a lot of what he was doing was being made to run on the spot, with his arms outstretched in front of him. Sometimes when he was running on the spot, he was clearly made to lift his knees very high, because his whole gait changed. The way he was moving changed. You could see there was a much greater effort being carried out. He was getting quite tired, I noticed, because he staggered on occasion, was wiping his forehead. So I assumed that he was sweating from the exertion, and every now and then he would go down. He would disappear from view. But the police officer standing over him, and at times the only time I ever heard the actual words being said, because all the time there was a murmur of voices, but the only time I ever heard any actual thing said was when they said things like, "Who told you to stop?" or 10 more, do 10 more. So, and that particularly was happening when he was down out of view. So the only assumption that I could make was he was doing more exercises, possibly push-ups or sit-ups. I don't know what it would have been because I couldn't see. But then when he came up again, he was again clearly tired, staggering, wiping himself, but then again being made to run on the spot.
And did you construe the strenuous exercises he was made to do as a form of punishment?
Absolutely. There was no other reason why, as a political detainee, he would be standing in an office on the 10th floor of John Foster Square doing exercises with 3 policemen walking around him, shouting at him. That could be the only conclusion.
That's right.
Yeah.
And this was not a gymnasium.
Correct.
This was the 10th floor of John Foster Square.
But in addition to that, the other thing that was happening was that at least the one police officer had something in his hand which looked, again, it was impossible to discern exactly what it was, but it looked like a rolled up newspaper or a rolled up magazine or something of that nature. And they were, this police officer was hitting Neil with this thing. Not very hard, more, I think, as a form of harassment than assault, if you want to make that differentiation. But clearly harassing him as he was doing these exercises, as he was running up and down, just going around and hitting him on the body, on his upper torso. And there was the other thing that happened, again, and of course, I am again surmising, because there were certain things I couldn't actually see, but it was, but I could surmise from what happened. There was an occasion when one of the officers appeared to adjust his clothing, to do something around his waist, and this is why Neil was down on the ground, out of my view, and then I saw the officer lift his arm, and I heard a noise of something striking, what sounded like striking flesh. And so I concluded that he may have taken a belt off and was hitting Neil with the belt. But it may have been with his hand, it may have been with the newspaper again, I don't know. But certainly that appeared to be what was happening. And what's important to understand about all of this is that I was deliberately watching and trying to record in my own mind what was going on, because I knew that somehow it was important for me to get the information out to people, to the DPSC in particular, and so that they could actually then make some effort to bring legal action, etc., to try and stop whatever was being done to Neil, bring some kind of court action to protect Neil from what was happening to him. Yeah.
You also indicate that the striking with the rolled-up newspaper or magazine, paragraph 29 of the affidavit, that particularly when his arms were sagging, that's when he was struck more.
Correct. Yeah, to encourage him to lift his arms up again. Correct.
If you could just clear up one thing, Mr. Smithers. In your affidavit, you indicate that the abuse, as in the exercises and the striking, commenced before you were taken to the optometrist. In your oral evidence, you've indicated that while you did view Dr. Aggett through the grip glass before being taken to the optometrist, the actual abuse commenced afterwards.
Correct. When I was going through my original testimony, which was 38 years ago. Yeah. I think that over time, what has happened is that my memory kind of merged the various things that happened. So when I read the testimony that I gave at the time, and this is one of the cases I was referring to earlier on, when I read the testimony that I gave in 1982, I realized that it was indeed the case that that in the first period there was no actual physical abuse taking place. There was intense questioning, intense engagement, as I said to you, this kind of circling, threatening, circling action taking place, with Neil talking and engaging in that way with the police, but there was no actual physical abuse at that time. That all actually I only saw happening when I came back. But I had got that confused by the time I did the affidavit last year or the year before with you.
Now, you mentioned that there were some black security branch officers with you in that room.
Yeah.
While you were observing what was happening to Dr. Aggett next door, what were they doing and what was their reaction?
They were just sitting there. I mean, I don't recall exactly what they were doing, but they were sitting there, maybe reading a newspaper, maybe just staring out the window. They did not seem to find it strange or peculiar, and I'm talking about both times. I'm talking about the time before I went to the optician and the time that I came back. They didn't seem to find it a problem, almost, that a detainee was sitting in the room and watching another detainee being tortured. They never said anything to me. When I looked at them, there was nothing, there was not even a recognition or some indication from them that they felt that it was a problem. I found it so strange that I began to wonder whether it was almost deliberate, because I thought perhaps they were trying to intimidate me and saying to me, this is what could happen to you. Now, in the previous inquest, the question that was asked of me is why would the police want to intimidate me if I was, if my interrogation was already finished, if I had finished my statement. What I obviously couldn't say at that time, in that inquest, was that I was working underground for the ANC. They hadn't actually discovered that. But I had no idea whether in the interim they had actually managed to get further information, get new information, just as they had done after my first detention, which occasioned my second detention, when they had got new information which they wanted to find out from me about the box of chocolates. I assumed there was a possibility that they had more information, or that they were at least sufficiently. In fact, Captain Van Niekerk even said to me at a certain point, he said, "I know you're lying, I know you're hiding something," even during my statement. So I assumed perhaps this is why, because it was completely baffling to me that this would be happening, that I could be sitting in this room and seeing this thing happening, and it didn't seem to matter to anybody that I was seeing it.
And you say that this saga continued for approximately an hour.
Yeah.
How did it come to a conclusion?
Eventually, all the way through, the reason I knew about the time, by the way, was I didn't have a watch. Obviously, I was a political prisoner. I didn't have a watch. But so all the time, because I was trying to record the information so I'd be able to get the information out if I could, I was asking the police officer what the time was. And so I kind of built up this picture of the time. And so about 55 minutes to an hour after I'd come back from the optician, they suddenly stopped. In fact, there seemed to be a kind of a flurry outside of somebody else arriving outside that room. And then Neil was told to stop. There was indication that he was told to stop what he was doing. And then he bent down, and his gesture, the way he bent down, was, it looked, he kind of bent forward and then stood up again. And then he bent forward a second time and stood up again. And what that made me realize is that he had probably been naked. Because what it appeared that he was doing, each time that he bent forward, was first he was pulling on his underwear, and then he was pulling on a pair of trousers. And then having done that, he pulled his shirt over his head, and then he was led out and taken away.
And then what transpired? Were you at some point taken back to Randburg?
Then I was taken, shortly after that I was taken back to Randburg by the police, yeah.
And after witnessing such a disturbing event, how did you feel when you were taken back to your cell in Randburg?
Well, I was assailed with a range of conflicting emotions. While I was sitting in the room, particularly in the second phase, after coming back from the optician, I felt a huge amount of anger because of what I was seeing happening, but I also felt completely helpless because I wanted to do something. There was a moment at which I actually contemplated picking up a chair and flinging it through the window of the room that they were in, with a view to, I guess, saying to the police, you've been watched, kind of thing, and that Neil would also know that he wasn't alone. But I realized that would be probably a fairly foolish thing to do, because it could only have negative consequences for me, but also, and more importantly, it wouldn't achieve anything for Neil. Because even if I did do that, how would how would that change anything for Neil? Why would the police even care that I knew or that I'd seen what was happening? And so I decided, like I said, that my job was to record what was happening so that I could give a reasonable account of what I'd seen and get that information out so that at least people who did have the capacity to deal with it, which would be people like the Detainees Parent Support Committee and the lawyers and lawyers would be able to try and take action. When I got back to the police station, to Randburg Police Station, I was feeling pretty devastated, not really knowing what to do. I felt a series of emotions. Like I said, I felt anger, I felt this sense of helplessness. I felt concern for Neil, and I guess concern for all of us, because if that was happening to Neil, it could be happening to all of us. I almost wanted to identify with Neil. I think I was in a very disturbed state, actually, and so I started to force myself to do the same kind of exercises that Neil was doing, but in a very punishing way. So forcing myself to run on the spot, and possibly even crying while I was doing it, just out of rage and frustration and everything else. And it was a way, I guess, of getting rid of the tension that I'd experienced through that whole incident, but also in a perverse kind of way to identify with Neil and kind of try and feel the pain and the frustration and indignity and so on that he'd gone through. And I tried that for 3 days, actually, every day, until I eventually was so sore that I couldn't continue.
Were you seeing perhaps whether you could withstand similar?
Well, I think there was that too. I think that having seen this happening to Neil and considering that there was a possibility, however remote, that my interrogation might start again, and that if it did, it might move into a different phase, a similar phase to what I'd seen happening with Neil. Would I be able to handle it? How would I, would I be able to continue without collapsing, without breaking, and so on? So there was that element of it as well. It was, as I said, it was very complex. It was very difficult. A few hours actually after I got back.
So then you decided to take some kind of action to alert the outside world. Can you explain your efforts?
Yeah. You see, and again, this is not something that I was able to talk about in the earlier inquest. When I went to Randburg Police Station, look, all prisoners, particularly political prisoners, are going to try and devise ways to get messages out, to get information out. And so, when I got to Randburg Police Station, I was in a cell on my own. With a little exercise yard next to it, but above the toilet there was a window, and if I looked out that window, running along all the cells, there was actually a wall outside. So if you imagine the cells are here, these are the cells, there was like a wall over here that you couldn't see, that was the same height as the window, so you couldn't see over the wall, and a passage running between them, an open air passage. And at the end of that passage was a gate. And because I was in the first cell, right at the end of that passage, I could see the gate. And from the gate, I could see into the parking lot of the police station. There was a kind of a lawn, a piece of lawn coming down and in the parking lot. And I realized, this is my first detention, I realized that actually if somebody came to see me, I would be able to see them in the parking lot. And so I'd somehow acquired a pen, and I wrote a small note, which I then hid in the jacket that I had. And after the first week, they allowed me a change of clothing, so I sent the jacket out in the hope that my seasoned political friends would realize that there was possibly a note hidden somewhere in my clothing. Unfortunately, they didn't, and so they just washed the jacket and destroyed the note. So when I came out of detention that time, I was able to explain to them that this is what I tried to do. So when I went back to
So to be clear, that experience you just related to the court was from your first detention, not
Correct.
second detention.
Correct, it was from my first detention. And the note basically said to them, come to the police station, come and park in the parking lot, and then turn on the car radio, and I said play a particular piece of music, which was a song by Leonard Cohen called So Long Marianne. And the first line of that song is, come over to the window, my little darling. And I knew it was pretty unlikely that sort of the average person would come and park in the parking lot of the Randburg police station and play that song. So I would know that it was them, and then I would go to the window and at least I would get to see them. So that was the idea. So when I went back into Randburg police station, and I was put into exactly the same cell, I was in exactly the same circumstances, and so therefore I realized that I would be able to have some kind of contact with them. And I sent the same message out, saying I'm in the same cell. And this time they did find it. And so indeed they began to come. And at first they would sit on the grass and play music, and I would just see them and wave or whatever it was. And then I started to realize, because I was surrounded by ordinary prisoners, I used to often hear people, family members of the other prisoners, standing outside the wall, on the other side of the wall, and calling to their friends and calling to their families and saying, whatever, talking about food, money, whatever it was that they were talking about. And I started to realize that actually if my friends came up to the gate and spoke to me, nobody would even notice. And I think it was because the uniform branch didn't have the same understanding, didn't have a clear understanding of what it meant to have a political prisoner in their midst, and that you wouldn't want people from outside coming talking to that political prisoner. And so that began to happen. So they, I remember the first time I called them, I said, come stand by the gate. And they did, and we chatted and so on. And then eventually I worked out that the toilet had a long wire, like the kind of wire that wire coat hangers are made of. It had a long wire and I could disengage it. And so I started to take the little straw from a liquid fruit and put it on the end of the wire with a message inside it, and I was able to pass it out. And then I would get money in that way as well, notes, and that was very useful then, because I was able to use that to buy newspapers and so on, even though I wasn't supposed to read newspapers, but I managed to do that. So when I got back to the police station, and after I'd done the exercise and after I'd kind of calmed down from what had happened, I thought, okay, what do I do now? And I thought, well, the only thing that I can do right now is hope that somebody will come and see me, because if they do, I'll be able to then pass them a note, and they'll be able to then go to the DPSC and give them the information about what I'd seen with Neil, and that Neil would then be afforded some kind of protection. So I had a Bible, because the first month I was only allowed a Bible. So I had a Bible, and I tore a page out of the note section of the Bible, and I wrote this note, just explaining what I'd seen happening, and saying that somebody should do something. And then I waited. And there was nothing I could do. There was no way that I could actually will people to come. I mean, I tried, but it didn't work. And so for the next 10 days, nobody came to see me. I did get clothes, but I didn't want to risk hiding the note in clothing, because obviously I knew the police did search the clothing to see if they could find notes, and I didn't mind if I sent out an innocuous note, but I didn't want to take a risk and put this note into my clothing in case it got found. So I just waited, and nobody came, and then on the 5th of February I happened to ask one of the police officers to go and buy me a newspaper, and he did, and he brought it back, and the headline was that Neil had died.
That must have been just devastating for you, Mr. Smithers.
Well, you know, it basically, I just felt this huge amount of guilt, actually. That was the main thing I felt, because I felt as though I had let Neil down. That I almost felt like I could have done something to tell me more, to get that message out, to get the information out, and that I'd failed him. So it was a very, very, very difficult few hours for me, and I reread the article a few times, and in the article it said that the detainees' parents' support committee was trying to arrange visits for the rest of us, because obviously they were now worried, or everybody was worried, all families were worried about the fact that that their family members were there. And so I knew that I'd probably be giving a visit the next day. And so I thought, well, this is going to have to be my opportunity to get this message out. I don't know how I'm going to do it, because if I have a visit, it's most probably going to be at John Vorster Square. And if it is at John Vorster Square, it's going to be difficult to communicate, because what we used to have happen if we had visits, which we did have occasionally, we always had a police officer sitting, usually very closely. I can remember this one police officer, when my partner used to come and visit me, he would sit, one of us would be here and the other one here, and he'd be sitting here almost like watching a tennis match, because he would, you know, as we were speaking, he would go like this the whole time, watching to see what we were saying and making sure that we weren't saying anything that we weren't supposed to be saying. So I didn't quite know how I was going to manage it, but I thought it's the only opportunity that I'm going to have. And I didn't know who was going to come and see me either, because I hoped that it would be my partner. I guess it could have been a family member, but I wasn't certain. So knowing that I would probably get a visit, I decided to rewrite the note, but now to indicate that I knew that Neil had died, and to say that I hope that somehow the information that I'm going to give them is going to help to try and find out how it happened and what happened and so on. And that at least people would know that that this torture had been happening. And at that stage, I didn't know that there had been other information about Neil being tortured, etc. I found that out later, that he'd written statements himself, and other people, he'd spoken to other people about it. So I didn't know at that stage that I wasn't the only person who was aware that he was being tortured. And so I rewrote the note indicating that I knew this, and then I prepared the note, put it into a matchbox, and put a false bottom in the matchbox, so that the matchbox appeared to be innocent, innocuous, but if somebody fiddled around with it enough, they would find there was a false bottom to it, and they would find the note underneath it. And that's what I did in preparation for the meeting the next day.
And in fact, it was your sister who came to the meeting? Justice Gray?
Yeah, it was my older sister. My partner was away and couldn't get back in time, and so it was my sister who came to see me.
And explain to the court how you managed to pass over the motus suspension.
Well, luckily, and perhaps, I don't know why it was done like this time. Maybe it was because it wasn't a normal kind of visit. But when we went in, it was a similar room to the one that I had been in when I saw Neil. Well, I'm not sure which floor it was on, but 9th or 10th. But when we went into the room, I was sitting in a chair next to a table, a normal office table, and the police officer, the white police officer, was sitting on the other side of the table, which meant the table was between us, and that he couldn't see below, this kind of waist level, I guess. So that was incredibly fortuitous, because my sister came in and she sat directly opposite me. So our knees were almost touching. And that meant he also couldn't see much below the waist, below her waist, because of the table being in the way. So we had this conversation, and at some point I pulled out a tissue, and at the same time pulled out the matchbox. And I put the matchbox on my knee, and while we were talking, I was trying to do this while we were talking so the police officer wouldn't have any indication of what was going on. And I was trying to, with my eyes and my hand, trying to indicate the matchbox to her so that she would know that I wanted her to take it. And she realized that, and I must say, to her credit, she was very clever, because she then took a tissue out and blew her nose, and then with the tissue in her hand, she placed it over the matchbox on my leg, but like in a sort of intimate gesture of support and so on to me, but covering the matchbox. And then she was able to, at the right moment, to pick it up and just put the matchbox and the tissue back into her handbag. And so that was done. And then she left. Then they ended the visit then, and it was a very emotional parting almost, because she said to me as she was leaving, she said, "Please be careful, you're my only brother." And I was feeling anyway quite emotional about our family situation, because something that I didn't mention earlier is that a week after I was detained the second time, so it must have been towards the end of November, I don't know the exact date, I got a visit from my other sister, who came to tell me that my father had died. And so I had to process that as well, and the fact that the police wouldn't allow me to have a visit, to go to the funeral. So from that family point of view, when my sister said this to me about being her only brother, it kind of added to the emotional turmoil that I was in at the time. Anyway, we finished off the visit, and I was then taken back to Randburg police station and left there. And then another week went by, and again, and I seem to get the timing all wrong about all right around this, but I again asked for these guys to buy me a newspaper, and I got a newspaper, and the headline this time was that Helen Suzman had read my note out in Parliament. And later on I discovered that my sister and her husband had, once they'd found the note, they thought the only thing to do was to give it to Helen Suzman, and she used the opportunity of being in Parliament to read it out. And once again I was thrown into huge emotional turmoil, because I thought, that's it, I'm gone, because the police were very careful about keeping records of moving people around. You know, people were signed in, people were signed out, and so I thought it was impossible for them not to know that it was me who sent the note out, because they had to be able to just track the movement of everyone and say, well, where was Neil at that time, which office was he in, who was in the office next door, etc., and they would have worked it out. So I spent the next few days absolutely unsure, what was going to happen, whether I was going to live, whether I was going to, whether I was going to be fetched and go through the same kind of thing that Neil went through. I had no clue.
If we could just pause for a moment and return to the note. I understand that the note was Exhibit E1 before the first inquest. It's also attached as an annex to this affidavit. That's right. So it's an annex to Exhibit G9. Mr. Smithers, the text of the note is not a long note. It's set out under paragraph 41 on page 13 of the affidavit.
Here it is, yeah.
And I'd like you to read the note into the record.
Okay. On the 25th, I was at John Forster Square, JVS, from plus minus 9:30 to 10 o'clock, and plus minus 11 o'clock to 12:15. In the first period, I saw Neil being interrogated by plus minus 6 guys, then some left and 3 remained. Neil was standing all the time. In the second period, he was still standing, except he was naked. He was made to do push-ups a substantial number. He was hit either with a belt or a rolled-up newspaper while doing them. Then he had to get up and run on the spot, arms outstretched in front of him. Every so often he was made to lift his legs up high while running, and all of this was interspersed with more push-ups. All the while he was being interrogated. The hitting with the newspaper went on all the time, especially if his arms sagged. He was sweating profusely, and when once he nearly fell over a chair with exhaustion, he was further harassed. When he got dressed after 12 o'clock, he was pushed around even then. It was clear that he was completely naked because he obviously drew on his underpants and then his trousers. I could only imagine how often he had to go through this and what worse things were done to him. Use this info, but for the moment don't use the date or my name, but keep the note in a very safe place in case it's needed later. Please give Yvette especially, but also everyone else, all my love and strength. We must go on. I didn't know Neil very well, but he was obviously a very special person. His killing mustn't be for nothing. I'm okay. Nothing has been done to me. I don't think anything will be done. I'm not that important. Take care, Maurice.
Thank you. Now, if we can just return for a moment to the black officers who were present with you in the room. And you'll recall that one of them, a Mahano Gurdin Maketa, gave evidence in the first inquest and in fact contradicted your version of events.
Correct.
Do you recall how he attempted to contradict you?
Well, he said that there was nothing going on in the room next door, and he also said he didn't have a watch So therefore he couldn't have told me the time.
And in your view, was that evidence false?
Completely.
So I can advise you that Mr. Maketa will be testifying in the reopened inquest. And the Lord, his affidavit, which has been already put up, I believe is exhibit G6. Mr. Smithers, before this inquest, he will confirm that he was in the office 1011 with you, and that in fact he did witness what was going on in the office next door. But that at that particular point in time, he felt fearful and had to comply with the instructions of the security branch. Do you have a response to that development?
Well, I was aware, Judge. I was aware of this because at the on-site visit to the prison, to the police station on the second day of the inquest, he was present, and he indicated then that he didn't talk about the issue of the timing as far as I recall, but he certainly did indicate that there was activity going on in the room, and there was somebody who was being made to jump up and down, as he put it, and so on. And he also indicated that he was in a position at the time where, had he said anything, he would have been in trouble, and therefore he had to lie.
While we're dealing with the first inquest, you indicate in your affidavit that there were attempts by the legal team for the police to discredit you on what appears to be the most petty grounds, such as the spelling of your name and the taking of the oath.
Correct.
Can you elaborate on that, please?
Judge, I had actually, it's true that I did spell my name in two different ways, and that was just a personal historical choice that I'd made, partly related to a general irritation that I had that people always spelled my name incorrectly. Because my name is spelt Maurice in the French way, but my family always called me Morris, so people always spelt it as Morris the English way, which is M-O-R-R-I-S. And so I had the situation where I wasn't spelling my name in the official way, as M-A-U-R-I-C-E. So everyone knew me as M-O-R-I-C-E, which was my own particular concoction. And so I also signed myself as M-O-R-I-C-E. But of course, legally, the name was M-A-U-R-I-C-E. And the police seized on this as some kind of evidence that I couldn't be trusted or something. So I was trying to hide my name, although I think that had I been having a false name, I wouldn't have actually just had an alternative spelling of my own name. I did in fact have a secret name, but it wasn't M-O-R-I-C-E, it was Martin, I think, if I remember correctly. That was my nom de plume as an underground ANC person. And the other thing that happened was that when I made my statement when I was in detention, I took the oath. I don't recall when I took the oath the phrase "so help me God" being used. Somebody, I think, just said, "Will I take the oath and that will I tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth," and so on. But I suppose even if I'm not a religious person, I'm not a practicing Christian or any other kind of religion. Even at the time, I think I probably would have agreed, because that was the way that the average person, that was the norm, that people took the oath. And I didn't want to rock the boat any further. I was in a very delicate position, being in prison and being in the hands of the security police. And for me to have made an issue at the time about using the oath, I think would have probably caused more difficulties than I thought was necessary. And so I took the oath. When I then appeared in court for the inquest, I affirmed. And partly, I suppose, because my objective situation was different, and I didn't feel as threatened, although it was a hostile court. But nevertheless, I felt able to say that I affirmed rather than taking the oath. And so, yeah, that was the reason. And they used both of those as a way to attempt to discredit me and say I was an untrustworthy witness.
Thank you. Mr. Smithers, before I close and hand over to my colleague for the state, is there anything further you wish to add in conclusion?
I don't think so. I think that, at this point, just to say, like I said earlier on, I think in my statement that I'm very happy to have had the opportunity of actually talking about this and coming and being able to tell the story again and to tell it more fully because of the different circumstances, but also that we will hopefully find out what the truth is, because it was a very devastating experience for everybody, and there needs to be proper closure around it, so there is a sense that the truth has been. Whether we'll get to the full truth, I don't know, but hopefully we will get as close to the truth as possible, and be able to continue continue with the sense that at least Neil's death has been understood and honoured almost. Yeah. But as far as evidence goes, I don't think there's any more information that I can give you at this point in time in relation to, except maybe it's useful to mention that although I did say that the police didn't appear to know that I was the one who gave evidence, that I was the one who wrote the note, I was very surprised when I came out of detention that I was served on it with a banning order. And I honestly didn't believe that I was doing enough to justify having a banning order. And the only conclusion that I could reach was that it was a vindictive act to get at me for having sent out this note and having given evidence at the inquest. And this is a way that they could do it without having to answer for it. Because when banning orders were issued, there was no obligation on the state to actually explain why the person had been banned in great detail. All they had to do was say the person is a threat to the state. The activities have been a threat to the state. And that would be the way that they could actually punish me, I guess, for having sent out this note and for having exposed what had happened. Because if they'd done it, I think they realised if they'd done anything to me while I was in prison still, that would have not. I was almost untouchable. because they knew that Helen Suzman and various other people knew who'd sent the note out, and something happened to me, there would have been a major incident. It would have been a major incident. So I'm surmising. I'm not saying it is why, but it could be one of the reasons why they actually served me with that 2-year banning order.
What were the basic terms of the banning order?
Well, with the banning order, it meant basically that you had to stay within a certain magisterial district unless you got permission from the police to move. You had to report to the police once a week. You weren't allowed to go into a educational institution. You weren't allowed even to go into a courtroom unless you had reason to be there. You weren't supposed to be with more than one person at a time. You couldn't communicate with another banned person. So those were the kinds of things.
Certain hours?
No, that wasn't house arrest. That was house arrest. Some people, like Helen Joseph and others, had house arrest, and that meant you had to be at home at certain hours. But no, I wasn't under house arrest. That was the banning order. Yeah.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you. Councillor, what do you want to do now?
No, no, that's it. It's 4 o'clock already. May we be permitted to stand down after tomorrow?
Okay. We cannot continue today because of the time.
Sure.
Will you please continue that day tomorrow?
No problem.
Morning,
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Ik dacht peanuts. Het is entweder 20 peanuts of peanuts. Ja.
I'm assuming you guys want to be.
What did the guy say? Cockatry or what?
Excuse me.
Will you all be able to get your license? They don't usually get certificate.
Depends on the traffic. You leave, you're at 7. So,
You know why? Because it used to be a problem.